Now we have another cluster of prophecies that seem to go back to the 8th century, back to the time of the original Isaiah, in chapters 28 to 32.
Mm-hmm.
So this is coming after the so-called apocalypse of Isaiah in 24 to 27,
Mm-hmm.
which we leave for the end.
Yeah.
Now these are more scattered oracles than the ones we've been dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
They hop around a little bit more. There are some quite striking images in them. One that caught my eye here is in chapter 28, verse 15. Hear the word of the Lord, you scoffers, who rule this people in Jerusalem. Now, interestingly enough, even though he seems to be a counselor to the king in a way, he is not shy about criticizing the rulers. Because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we have an agreement. When the overwhelming scourge passes through, it will not come to us. So, now, death was often thought of as a god,
Mm-hmm.
as a deity, and so for that it was the netherworld. This is where you get Belial later on. The implication of this, if I'm reading it right, is that they are saying, we have a deal with death and it won't strike us.
It's a little bit like a little bit like the Passover moment in Exodus.
It is, yeah.
Right, but with the implication of we've made a deal with death, at least to the modern ear, sounds it's a little Faustian, obviously.
It is, yes. And you see, where in the Passover, the deal is with the Lord to protect you.
Right.
Whereas this time,
the deal is with
the
death to leave you alone.
Death is never good.
Right. But so is this something of in Isaiah's telling of it, it seems very much like actually a conscious inversion of that sort of Zion theology, right? Where it was understood that God had made a deal with David's line,
yes,
that Jerusalem would always remain and Zion would always remain. And essentially Isaiah is saying, that's not a deal that God made with David. That's a deal that you today have made with death. It's
with death. What that would have meant in practice, I think, and I'm getting a little bit ahead here in some of the stuff we're coming to, but I think what he's being critical of is making an alliance with Egypt, for example, looking for alliances with other powers. And what he says, and it's very typical Isaiah, see, I am laying in Zion a foundation stone, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. One who trusts in her will not panic.
Yeah. So it's he's not denying the core of that Zion theology. He actually thinks that Zion is going to remain. But that one should rely on that promise to David, that rely on God's version of it, rather than on some other means of avoiding Zion's destruction.
Yeah. It's quite striking. You wonder how this would have worked out in practice. What would a king like Hezekiah say have done, or Ahaz? But I take it what he means is you do not rebel, you do not try to defend yourself, you count on the Lord to do it.
Right.
Which is a big ask.
Right. As we'll see, that's actually seems to have been effective as a strategy against all odds.
Yeah.
And as we said at the beginning, right? Why do prophecies sort of retain their power over generations? It's because they got something right.
Yeah.
This is an almost unthinkable thing to have gotten right, which is if you do nothing and let them just come, Jerusalem will stay.
Yeah.
But that does seem to be the message. You can imagine that for Isaiah's listeners, that was a hard one to wrap their heads around.
In chapter 29, Ariel, the city where David encamped, so I assume he's talking about Jerusalem, add year to year, let the festivals run their round. I will distress Ariel, and like David I will encamp against you. But the multitude of your foes shall be like small dust, and the multitude of tyrants shall be like flying chaff. In an instant suddenly you'll be visited by the Lord of hosts, and the multitude of the nations that fight against Ariel shall be like a dream or a vision. Now, this touches on what's called the myth of the inviolability of Zion.
Mm-hmm.
The idea God is in that city, it cannot be moved.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a few Psalms that say that quite explicitly.
Mm-hmm.
Does Isaiah actually believe that?
Oh, I think so.
Yeah.
I think Isaiah is absolutely, for all of his castigation of the way things have been, for all of his arguments against the cult that we saw earlier, or against the way that it's been practiced, it's not a particularly revolutionary theological move that he's making, right? His political commentary, his social commentary are confrontational, but at the core of it, he believes in what has always been the case, right? We talked sort of earlier about the maintaining of the status quo with regard to the nature of the royal court and the Davidic line. He is firmly sold on David's line continuing and on Zion continuing.
Yeah.
And it's just that he's essentially tearing down everything around that.
Yes, and this will not prevent you from being brought low to the dust every now and then.
Sure.
But the challenge from his point of view is you never lose that faith. You never lose that trust in it. We should probably have said something on the contrast between his framework and what you get in other prophets like Amos and Hosea,
Mm-hmm.
who came from the north, or even some of the later Judean ones like Jeremiah. For Isaiah, it's all about David and Jerusalem.
Right.
No talk about the Exodus to speak of.
Right. And I mean, I think part of that has to do with his position sort of as, right, central intermediary,
Yeah.
right? He's in there, right? This is his world, is the world of the court, the world of politics, right? Amos and others who envision the downfall of everything may not be quite as, right, sort of
invested.
right. It's like Isaiah really is in like the equivalent of the Washington D.C. political bubble, right? That's what he's thinking about and talking about, and he can't imagine that really ever changing substantially.
Yeah. But it's evident from this that there were problems within the bubble, that some of the other counselors at court probably had very little time for this guy.
Sure, and I mean, this is as classic a prophetic trope as we have in the Bible, which is, I'm saying these hard things to hear, and there's all these other guys who are, giving you an entirely different message, but I'm the real one who should remain.
And what he says here in 29:14, the wisdom of their wise shall perish. You who hide a plan too deep for the Lord, and whose deeds are in the dark, who say, who sees us, who knows? So in several passages like this, he is almost making fun of the wise,
Mm-hmm.
the people who think they're wise, who are wise in their own eyes. And what he puts against them is just his dogma, you might say, of trust. In quietness and trust, you will be saved.
Right. So when we think about like what is the practical reaction to this kind of prophecy, we have to remember that the king is not just hearing from Isaiah, right?
Yeah.
That he's getting all sorts of contradictory counsel, almost entirely contradictory to this, you would think, and so part of Isaiah's task is to convince his audience, which may be the king himself, first and foremost, that there is, there's a reason not to listen.
And he evidently didn't succeed all the time either.
Right.
Because Hezekiah, after all, did rebel against Assyria.
Yeah.
And in that, he must have gone with the advice of the wise, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Beginning of chapter 31, alas for those who go down to Egypt for help, who rely on horses and trust in chariots because they are many. Horses, of course, were the tanks of their day. That this was, what constituted the might of an army. And what they're constantly trying to do is get horses from Egypt. But do not look to the Holy One of Israel or consult the Lord, yet he too is wise and brings disaster. And then he says the Egyptians are human and not God, man and not God. Their horses are flesh and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, the helper will stumble and the one helped will fall.
Yeah, it's a remarkable image of what happens when you are over-reliant on someone else, right? The notion of the rider on the horse, right? What happens, if you trust in the horse, what happens when the horse falls? Right? As you've said, right, this is Isaiah's message from the beginning. Right? You're supposed to trust in God and not look to the north for help, right? Not look to the south in Egypt for help. It's even though obviously, right, there's such fear of being destroyed, as everybody else is being destroyed, that it's only natural, right, to cling to what looks like the only plausible option. But Egypt of all places, right?
I know.
Which at this point is. Historically is hardly a superpower the way that it may once have been, but also has obviously such great resonance for Israel.
Yeah, although it doesn't seem to have that kind of resonance in the book of Isaiah. They don't say that's the house of slavery.
Right, it's not like Jeremiah.
No, because they don't really. It's not informed by the Exodus tradition.
Right.
In the same way. This contrast, though, I think of flesh and spirit is interesting because later on, the distinction we all inherited really from Greek philosophy is flesh and spirit being mind or something like that. Here, it's power. Right. Flesh is that which is corruptible and mortal and dies. Spirit is like the Holy One of Israel, is the immortal, incorruptible.
Yeah.
That's the idea of it. And really that concept of the holiness of God, I think, runs through all of Isaiah.
Right, goes right back to the call narrative, as we said, right? That God is distinctive. And, you're return to Egypt, you're relying on someone who's just like you. Yeah. Right? There's a better path forward. In chapter 30, just to back up a minute, one of the things we find there is unusually for Isaiah, but not for other prophets, is reference to sort of a self-reference to the notion of writing down the message of the book. Right, we obviously have reference in Jeremiah explicitly to writing down the prophecies, but it's not so common or prominent in Isaiah. But here it is in chapter 30.
30, and we also actually had it in chapter 8 in a passage we didn't get to talk about, where he tells one of his disciples to write something down as a testimony. And I suppose in the ancient world they often put up inscriptions. You're getting to the point here where you can actually write things instead. I think that has something to do with the rise of Aramaic as a lingua franca, which was much more tractable than Akkadian. And so it becomes, this is really the beginnings, I think, of the prophetic literature. Get one of your students to take notes.
Right. But it also has not only a sort of the functional of writing it down, but there's a reason for doing this, right? This has to do with something we talked about earlier a bit too, which is the notion of sort of testimony, right, and exactly. Witness. Right. These texts, right? You write them down not for us now, but so that later when things have gone wrong, you can point to it and say, God told you so.
And then you will know.
Right.
Or as Ezekiel would say later on, you will know that there was a prophet among you.
Right. I mean, this is a notion that goes all the way back to Deuteronomy, right? At the end of Deuteronomy, when Moses writes down the poem that is to serve as the witness against the people in generations to come, that, you know, God knew all the way back at the time of Moses, almost really looking forward to this period, if not a little bit later. God knew that the people would fall. So the whole book, therefore, by the act of writing, as an assembly, becomes a witness